Welcome to Diagnosing Healthcare, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the healthcare lawyers at Epstein Becker Green, a leading law firm that has more than 40 years' experience serving clients in the healthcare industry nationwide.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Diagnosing Healthcare. Today, we're going to be discussing Congress's legislative agenda with respect to healthcare. I'm your host, Tim Murphy, an attorney at Epstein Becker Green's Healthcare and Life Sciences practice, based out of our Boston and Washington, D.C. offices. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the 117th Congress and what they might be doing with respect to healthcare and healthcare-related topics. We're going to focus on the prospect for additional coronavirus relief, and what that includes for healthcare stakeholders, as well as prospects for coverage expansion. Joining me for today's discussion is Mark Lutz, a partner in our Washington, D.C. healthcare practice and the firm's chair, and Philo Hall, a senior counsel in our Washington, D.C. healthcare practice. I personally have had the pleasure of working with Mark and Philo for a number of years now, and very excited to have them on the podcast. So welcome, Mark and Philo. I wanted to give each of you a moment to introduce yourselves. So let's start with Mark.
Thanks, Tim. As a firm, I think you know well that we have been watching the evolution of health policy now for almost 5 decades. I've been an observer and an advisor in this space for almost 4 decades, and am certainly cognizant that much interesting work for us evolves out of the health policy framework. In fact, it was the advent of the Federal HMO Act, which was Congress's first attempt around physician incentivization to promote cost-effective, quality, and comprehensive coverage, that caused the founding of our firm and the growth of our practice. So I know that our attorneys and our other professionals are very much looking forward to following the evolution of health policy in this administration and in the new Congress, particularly because of this president's unparalleled experience in the Senate, deep personal relationships with senators on both sides of the aisle, and knowledge of how to find common ground among them.
Thank you, Mark. Philo?
Thank you, Tim. Good to be talking with you and Mark today. I've been at Epstein Becker for about 9 years, advising providers, plans, and their vendors on public health care program compliance and reimbursement. Before becoming an attorney, though, I had an earlier career in federal healthcare policy, working in the Senate, the White House Domestic Policy Council, and as a counselor to the Secretary of HHS. And since then, I haven't been able to give up my old curiosity in public policy, particularly as it helps clients distinguish between all the healthcare, trade press, and political noise, which are the federal government actions and stories that actually truly impact the healthcare system, and helping clients really project what's coming around the corner.
Thank you both. And I really should say thank you for joining us again, Philo. I know you've been on a couple of podcasts at this point, and we're lucky to have you for your insight and to get to share that with the listeners. But before we start today's conversation, I wanted to just make sure that those listening to this at a later date know that this is being recorded on February 4th. So things may have changed, and there may be further developments, particularly around the coronavirus topics that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. So with that, while the focus of today's conversation is going to be on the legislative agenda, I think it is important that we add a little background, since last week we saw a couple of actions by the Biden administration. That'll provide a little bit of a contextual backdrop for what we're talking about. So last week, the administration issued an executive order which outlined some steps that the administration is going to take with respect to the ACA and Medicaid expansion. I was hoping, Philo, you could summarize that order and a couple of the other more recent executive orders for us.
Sure. And let's, put it into context that the Biden administration started off with 10 days of presidential actions, focusing executive orders on different high priority topics for each of the first 10 business days. January 21st was COVID Day, and January 28th was the Healthcare Day. The main healthcare EO from that day, executive order, I would broadly summarize as instructing federal agencies to protect and strengthen Medicaid and the ACA. Now, just a little reminder for folks on executive orders, because sometimes the trade press and the national press can get caught up on wow, there's this many executive orders that have come out of the White House on this day, and how does that compare with how many executive orders were done in a prior administration? And just a reminder for folks that unless it is the rare instance when a president is exercising authority that Congress has given only to him to exercise, executive orders can really be perceived as just memorandum to federal agencies, or almost as a press release stating this or that is the policy of the administration. And so if you hear about an executive order that is calling for some new regulation, that does not go into effect when the executive order is announced. Rather, the executive order is asking an agency to later develop a regulation. So there's still a regulatory process that has to take place before policy is turned into actual law. And so here's a great illustration. So step one of the Medicaid and ACA executive order was the president calling upon the Secretary of HHS to consider opening federally facilitated marketplaces for a new special enrollment period. The executive order asked HHS to consider that. Later that afternoon, on the 28th, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services then announced that it would open a special enrollment period for the federal exchanges to run from February 15th to May 15th. The original purpose of this was to help those who may have become uninsured or undercovered, moved into a situation where they have less than ideal coverage because of the economic crisis stemming from the pandemic. So that's like the original impetus behind this, but it's interesting to note that the CMS special enrollment period is open not just to the uninsured, but to all individuals who are currently enrolled in federally facilitated exchange plans. So it's an opportunity not just for new coverage, but for enrollees to switch coverage mid-year. That's the most material action. The second element of the executive order, let me just summarize it. So the most plain English way to say it is that it is directing HHS, Department of Labor, the Department of Treasury, the three federal agencies that really are deeply involved in healthcare coverage. And it's directing these agencies to review all Trump-era agency actions related to Medicaid and the ACA and consider whether any of those policies should be changed, revised, rescinded, or if new policies should be rolled out by those agencies to quote unquote strengthen the ACA. What do they mean by strengthening? The principles that the executive order highlighted included addressing the level of consumer protections within plans, addressing affordability, access to the exchanges, and overall access to coverage. So again, the executive order took a lot more words to say it, but it is really an open instruction to the agencies to begin the process of seeing what over the last 4 years in terms of ACA and Medicaid policy should perhaps be overturned or adjusted.
Thank you, Philo. Two things I want to just point out about what you just shared with us. So the first is that the tri-agencies are really what we're looking at for the future regulations that may come out or maybe reversed, and that's HHS, DOL, and the IRS. For those that haven't been following along for a long period of time, they have come out with a number of rules together and separately that are really what drive the Affordable Care Act. The second thing that I wanted to point out was that special enrollment period the EO announced, and then CMS followed up with, that's only for the federally facilitated exchanges. So there are a number of state exchanges that are still in operation, which we'll have to watch to see if they follow suit. So with that, I was hoping, Mark, that you could read the tea leaves a little bit here on what that, again, it's not a legislative agenda, this is an administrative agenda, but it is important context. And what does that tell us about the Biden administration's priorities and how they might fit with Congress and what might happen in the next couple of years?
Tim, I agree. Stakeholders should be following this pretty closely because it suggests that the administration will have a number of levers available to strengthen Medicaid and the ACA, and that is going to be the source of tailwinds, if you will, for service providers and the industries that support those service providers, maybe even a little more so, and much more so actually, than the near-term likelihood of an expansion of Medicare. And secondly, I think it's telling us that there is much that can be done and actually will be done that will result in meaningful growth in these programs. That's growth without the need for congressional action. And third, that these improvements, which result in what I think we can predict will be some meaningful increases in coverage, will, from the public's perspective, have the potential to improve health status of Americans, and from an investor perspective, have the ability to grow the top line revenue of a range of healthcare service and products businesses, and derivatively, the revenues of businesses that support those service providers. I think we can expect to see the Biden administration also looking to generally reduce the number of uninsured by raising, for instance, the upper income eligibility limit for healthcare premium subsidies, perhaps increasing premium tax credits for those purchasing plans through the ACA marketplace, maybe raising the Medicaid poverty level threshold, and encouraging the states that haven't expanded Medicaid under the ACA to adopt expanded coverage. All of that could result in significant favorable tailwinds for those who are providing healthcare services in this country.
And just to summarize for those of listening in, that was what's happened in the administration. You should stay listening to the podcast and hear what's going to happen in Congress. But no matter what happens in Congress, we think there's going to be some administrative action that's worth following. Turning to the real topic of our podcast today, the congressional priorities and prospects for changes. I think it's fair to say that congressional priorities and prospects break down into four subgroups, each within each other, that being COVID-related action and non-COVID-related action, and action that's going to require 60 votes in the Senate, and action that might be passed through something called budget reconciliation. I was hoping, Mark and Philo, you could provide a quick overview on the budget reconciliation front versus cloture vote and 60 votes in the Senate, just so that our listeners can have a good grounding on what we're talking about, because it's going to come up when we talk about the more substantive questions later.
Tim, you put your finger on an element of the Senate rules that has truly profound implications for what Congress will be able to accomplish. The Senate majority party can, as you point out, use the budget reconciliation pathway. The pathway is accessed by setting spending targets, passing budget resolutions, and developing legislation to satisfy those targets, and legislation that has federal spending or revenue implications can be done in the context of this so-called reconciliation process. And this is not just a pipe dream. I think you noticed yesterday that the House approved a budget resolution that in effect lays the groundwork for legislating additional COVID relief through the reconciliation pathway. Is that how you see it, Philo?
Yes, Congress is clearly setting up a path forward to perform some of this immediate COVID-related coverage expansion through this first COVID relief bill, this first Biden-era COVID relief bill. And it looks like at the moment that they are relying and will have to rely on the budget reconciliation vote process. So that can consist of, this is an exception to the rule that requires 60 votes, what's called a cloture vote, 60 votes to end debate in the Senate. And ongoing debate sometimes is called a filibuster. But it essentially means that major legislation in the Senate requires 60 votes to pass. But the exception is this reconciliation process that Mark mentioned. But you have to look through the Biden coverage expansion proposals and see which fall within that narrow set of cases of being provisions that increase or decrease revenue or impact taxes or overall spending. The provisions that can fit into that narrow window then can be passed with a 51 vote majority. We saw this, the last time we saw this, I think, was 2017, when congressional Republicans reduced the ACA individual mandate tax penalty to $0. It was just changing a tax provision, changing the value of a tax provision. So that was done through reconciliation, where otherwise they did not have 60 votes in the Senate to do it. So what can be done now? I think top of the list is, of course, increasing the value of the premium tax credit. I think that's squarely a 51 vote proposition, or expanding income eligibility for such tax credits. Those are the two main levers available to Congress right now that are clearly would fit within reconciliation. So basically, who's eligible for the premium tax credits and how rich are those premium tax credits? Theoretically, reconciliation could be used, I think as Mark hinted at, is increasing the federal matching rate for state Medicaid programs. And theoretically, Congress could increase the coverage mandate to some nominal amount above zero if it wanted to moot the current Supreme Court challenge to the ACA. But I think that's not likely. And I think I'm right, Tim, that if you want to hear about that, you can refer to an earlier podcast that you did for the details on that Supreme Court case.
You certainly could. I interviewed or discussed that with Stuart Gerson, who's a partner in our Washington, D.C. office, though we didn't talk about the possibility of Congress mooting it, which is fascinating. And I'll have to pick your brain about that later, Philo. And we do know from the ACA repeal attempts that Medicaid is theoretically, at least changing the FMAP or changing expansion, is something that they tried to do through reconciliation on that front. So all up to the Senate parliamentarian at the end of the day, what can fit and not fit in budget reconciliation. But that's another possibility.
Well, that's a great point, and which gets into what can or cannot be done by reconciliation. It's kind of up to the Senate, and it's kind of up how many votes can they have in the Senate to even agree on what's subject to reconciliation. So it is supposed to be provisions that are limited to revenue and not extraneous matters. And if someone is pushing something like Medicaid, or maybe capping personal premiums, but some other provision, the Senate parliamentarian can say, I think this is extraneous and not related solely to revenue. And then to overrule the parliamentarian, the Senate needs 60 votes. So really, anything can be passed through reconciliation if the Senate has 60 votes to agree to do so. But if you have 60 votes to support an idea, then you can get past a cloture vote, and you don't need to use the budget reconciliation process anyways.
Thank you. And now that we have that working understanding of how those two potential paths work, I think it's worth digging into the substance of the American Rescue COVID relief plan and what it means for stakeholders, what we know about it so far from the Biden administration. I don't know, Philo, do you have sort of an overview of what that contains?
Sure. And it's the American Rescue COVID relief plan. Biden's proposal really was an outline, a document of bulleted points and priorities. I'd say, I think it's between 10 and 20 pages. And it's provided to Congress. It is an outline of the priorities for then Congress to draft. So in terms of health coverage expansion, there's not a lot of detail. We can cover it very briefly. There's a call on Congress, I think, as we've discussed, to, quote, expand and increase the value of the premium tax credit, unquote. So I interpret that to mean raising the eligibility level and increasing the amount of the subsidy. Biden also called for capping personal marketplace plan premiums at no greater than 8.5% of enrollee income. And it also called out asking Congress to continue fully subsidizing COBRA coverage through September of this year. Now, of course, there's tons more in that proposal relevant to the healthcare marketplace in terms of vaccine and testing, treatment and tracing and distribution, and provider relief funds for providers. But those are the three big pieces for coverage expansion.
Thank you. And do you have a view today on whether or not those are going to make it through budget reconciliation? Obviously, not being the Senate parliamentarian, I'm not going to hold you to it.
I think the easiest votes are where you're just changing the value of a previously existing program. So the safest bet is on increasing the value of the premium tax credit and perhaps increasing the income threshold of who is eligible for the premium tax credit.
I think I agree with that. Although I do want to point out for the listeners that even if there's not ultimately a large portion of coverage expansion in what gets maybe eventually passed, that a lot of that state relief and vaccine money takes a lot of pressure off of some of the states whose budgets are pretty strapped. And you might see sort of a doormat effect where they're not making cuts to the Medicaid program in some states because there's additional funding that will allow them to keep those programs operating as they are today.
On top of that, Tim, I don't think we should underestimate the power of even some of those changes. I think we've seen Kaiser and other reputable sources estimate millions and millions of potential new enrollees powered by changes of the nature that you just described.
That's a good point. And Mark, while not included in the materials that we've seen for the American Rescue Plan, I know there's been a lot of COVID-related regulatory flexibilities in the last year that have come through CMS through emergency waivers. And a lot of stakeholders and people in the industry have thought that some of these were going to stick around. But right now, they're still dependent on the emergency powers that HHS and CMS has used to implement those waivers. Do you foresee any of these flexibilities becoming included in later relief packages or becoming more permanent?
I do, although I would have limited expectation that they'd be in the first round or even included in something that is passed through reconciliation. Obviously, the one that has sort of captured the imagination of the industry as well as would say beneficiaries is the evolution towards telehealth. The emergency situation, as you've indicated, resulted in temporary reimbursement of telehealth on par with in-office visits and raising payments for audio-only visits. And now CMS is paying on something like 100 additional services through telehealth. There is statute that needs to be attacked through some future legislation, particularly the restrictions on the use and reimbursement that exists, the geographic requirement that mandates a beneficiary live in a rural area, and the originating site requirement mandating that they travel to a local medical facility. So I think that's going to be on everyone's short list. It's very popular, again, with beneficiaries, and a lot of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle favor finalizing that or making that permanent in some fashion.
So it sounds like that in your tea leaves that you're reading, we're just looking for a vehicle for that to move at some point in this Congress or the next. But the expectation is we'll see some flexibilities expanded.
Agreed.
Which, of course, will continue to change with our shifting modalities of care. Mark sort of alluded to this in our description of the Biden administration's actions and what it might mean, and that Medicare may not be the source of the coverage expansion. But during the Democratic primary, at least prior to the pandemic, a lot of the coverage had focused on expansions of Medicare for all or a public option. And I was hoping, Filey, you might tell us what you think of the status of those potentials are today.
As you're correctly saying, significant expansion of public coverage was a major initiative, just the general concept. That's a priority shared by much of the Democratic coalition that did very well in 2020, winning the White House and the Senate and hanging on to the House. So Congress's first priority right now is dealing with COVID. And then once that is wrapped up, and also I think once the Senate has worked with the administration to confirm major cabinet appointees, those are the first two primary things that Congress must do immediately first. After that, I think you will see the congressional champions and committee chairs and other proponents of these major healthcare reform bills using the year to discuss and highlight and educate the public about these various and competing ambitious comprehensive proposals. I think Medicare for All will have champions that keep it on the radar screen. I can see committees holding hearings on a public option or maybe lowering the Medicare age. However, beyond that, I do not see congressional leadership or the White House has the time or the capacity or perhaps is willing to take the risk to do a serious push of trying to pass legislation in 2021. Now, maybe 2022. So, a few factors. One, they have a limited amount of time. Like we healthcare nerds, we can think of a whole bunch of different healthcare issues that Congress should focus on But we're competing with every other issue under the sun that Congress has to reserve time and attention for. So I think after dealing with healthcare, hopefully a little bit in this COVID relief bill, they may need to instead give the Biden administration time to staff up and think about more specifically what it wants its actual healthcare agenda to be. I will say, putting a political hat on, while the Democrats have a majority in the House and Senate, it is a narrow one. And the coalition is not fully on board for the public option or Medicare for all. So it might be tough with a narrow majority. I can imagine those who would not want to head into an election having a debate about maybe the real tough questions in a public option, which is, will providers be mandated to participate in the public option plan? And if they are, how will they be reimbursed? And how will those public option reimbursement rates compare to Medicare or commercial coverage? That might be a tough debate for some members of Congress to have leading into an election. So I think we'll hear a lot about it, but I think discussion for the year ahead, action maybe later.
Thank you, Philo. That's one interesting way of thinking about it, is the time constraint. And I had thought about the time constraint as in you only have 2 years, or you have the first 100 days is where things move. I had not thought about it in the way that you just placed it, in that the longer into the term you get, the closer you get to the election. I think you're probably right about the willingness of the caucus to engage in that debate given the margins right before another election.
I'm going to reemphasize here also, Tim, how important the time constraints are on congressional members and their staff. So there's a limited number of congressional members, and let's say on healthcare, they might have 1 or 2 staff focused on healthcare. Same goes for any issue area. When Congress actually sits down and focuses on really passing legislation, which is different than making a statement or debating something when they know it's not going to pass, but when they seriously are contemplating legislation that is going to pass, they put enormous time and effort into the issue. They're limited on how many different issues they can do at one time. And so a major bill can take a few weeks of comprehensive attention. And there's really only so many weeks in the year. They have congressional recesses as well. And we talk about these big healthcare issues. There's 24 other industry sectors that are having the same discussion right now. When is Congress going to give their issue like a month's worth of attention to pass some laws? And it's really a fight just for the time of the congressional members and their staff.
Thank you, Philo. Now, given that we don't expect to see the types of coverage expansions that were campaigned upon, at least early in the campaign and the Democratic side, or the prospects for that is certainly less. I do want to recirculate or return to the question that I asked Mark in the beginning of what that means for stakeholders, and what all of these, I guess, mean for stakeholders. I know that's something that you spent a lot of time thinking about, Mark, and I wondered if you had anything to sort of leave us with on the coverage expansions.
Well, Tim, thanks for returning to that point, because I know that all of us think it's quite consequential for investors in this market that have seen margins squeezed by high pandemic caseloads and costs and multiple pressures on revenues and expenses. So any tailwinds that can be derived from coverage expansion are material. But as I think we can have a real expectation that there will be material increases in the insured population and a corresponding decrease in provider bad debt, conceivably, from administration actions that do not require new legislation, whether they be special enrollment periods or funding consumer outreach relative to exchange products or reinsurance tools. All of that can power that market. And that secondly, we can have a real expectation that a budget reconciliation powered COVID relief bill will attack some things that'll be material to potential growth in the ACA covered population. For example, the coverage cliff. And as I said earlier, I think the estimates are that could generate as many as 9 million more enrollees on a free or a subsidized basis. And the extent that enrollment opportunities are opened up for maybe another 6 million in non-subsidized coverage enrollees. Now, parallel to that ACA enrollment growth, I think participants in the market should expect that there will be Biden administration efforts to broaden Medicaid coverage, which will be significant even short of a new legislative agenda by reversing the Trump administration policy around work requirements, by having healthcare.gov automatically determine Medicaid eligibility for those that use its algorithms, and by making some serious efforts to attack other barriers that currently exist to Medicaid enrollment. So we're saying the watchword should be look to the ACA and look to a more facilitated and enrollee-friendly Medicaid program for the tailwinds that we see powering the healthcare services sector in the months ahead.
Wonderful. I think that recaps a lot of our discussion today. Look to the administration for actions that are likely to expand coverage. The prospects for getting significant coverage expansions through Congress, and but when we say significant, we mean large changes to Medicare, are not great at the moment given the size of the Democratic majority. There will be other items that move, and we'll be paying attention, and you can check back in with us to discuss those items. I look forward, Mark and Philo, to having this discussion someday again in the office, hopefully soon. We're not remote. It's been great to talk to both of you today. Thank you for sharing your insight with the listeners.
Our pleasure for sure, Tim, and we're looking forward to continuing dialogue with the listening audience about these issues.
And on that note, if you're listening to this podcast, you can subscribe and download wherever podcasts are available. And we encourage you to do so because we'll have episodes coming out to deal with these issues and a variety of other issues that happen in the healthcare space twice a month and maybe more as we build up through the new year. So thank you again for tuning in. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Philo. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful and safe day.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Healthcare. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. The Employment Law This Week and Diagnosing Healthcare podcasts are presented by Epstein, Becker & Green, P.C. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of the legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.